"If you fix this engine, I'll give you my entire salary," the millionaire joked to the humble mechanic girl, not expecting the shock he was about to experience. But when she worked her magic, he was left speechless. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and be sure to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the ride. Paul Richardson, a man whose wealth could buy anything from luxury yachts to private jets, found himself standing in front of an old, decrepit garage in the middle of nowhere. His prized possession, a 1970s Chevelle SS, an iconic classic car that had been passed down through generations of his family, was now nothing more than a pile of dead metal. He had spent weeks taking it to high-end repair shops, each one promising they could fix the engine, only to watch them fail. Frustration built up inside him as he glanced at the garage, its crooked sign barely hanging on, missing letters, and an air of neglect that seemed to scream, "Last stop for broken dreams." With a deep sigh, he muttered to himself, "Is this where engines come to say goodbye?" His voice was tinged with sarcasm, but deep down, he was desperate for a solution, any solution. As Paul pushed the door open, the smell of oil and rust hit him immediately, almost overwhelming his senses. The interior was a stark contrast to the pristine showrooms he was used to. Old tires, dust-covered tools, and the hum of an old radio playing country music filled the space, giving it an almost nostalgic, rustic charm. He could barely make out a figure bent over the hood of a truck at the far end of the shop, covered in grease with work boots caked in dirt and worn jeans. The figure seemed to be as old as the shop itself. "Is anyone here who can fix a real classic?" Paul called out sarcastically, his frustration mounting. The figure stood up and turned to face him, wiping her hands on a rag. Paul raised an eyebrow as he looked at her, young, blonde with a sharp, confident smile that didn't quite fit with the gritty environment. "I'm the mechanic, Tessa Johnson," she replied, her voice calm and assured. "I can take a look at your car." Paul's eyes narrowed, both intrigued and skeptical. He had expected an older man, maybe someone with decades of experience, not a young woman who looked barely out of her 20s. "You?" Paul asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You're the mechanic here?" Tessa nodded without a hint of hesitation. "That's right," she said, crossing her arms. "And I can fix that Chevelle for you." Her confidence seemed to only add to Paul's amusement, but it was clear she wasn't backing down. He scoffed, looking at the rusted tools scattered around the shop. "I've taken this car to 7 different specialty shops," Paul continued, still skeptical. "Not one of them could figure out what's wrong with it. Not even the best engineers in Nashville." Tessa took a moment, studying him with a look that was both sharp and knowing. "Well," she said, a smirk playing at the corner of her mouth, "that only happened because you didn't come here first." Paul almost laughed at her boldness, but something about her unshaken confidence stirred his curiosity. Without thinking, he spoke before he could stop himself. "If you fix this engine, I'll give you my entire salary." His words were meant to be a joke, a way to mock the idea of her fixing his precious car. But Tessa didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him dead in the eyes and replied with a smirk, "All right, but I want it in cash." For a brief moment, Paul's pride was stung, but he tried to mask it with a chuckle. "I was just kidding," he said, thinking she would let it go. But Tessa didn't laugh. Instead, she walked over to a rusted cabinet, pulled out a toolbox with E. Barnes written on it, and started walking toward his car, as if she were about to unveil some family secret. Paul stood frozen, watching as she approached the Chevelle with the same ease and confidence he had seen from the best engineers, yet with none of the showiness. "Pop the hood," she said casually, as though this was just another routine job. Paul, still bemused, did as instructed, opening the hood without thinking. As Tessa peered inside, Paul stood next to her, arms crossed, waiting for the magic to happen. For the next few minutes, Tessa didn't say a word. She moved swiftly, almost as if she were listening to the engine, her hands moving in practiced motions, each movement fluid, yet deliberate. She grabbed a piece of hose, touched it to the engine block, and listened from the other end. Her focus was unshakable. Paul watched in stunned silence as she worked with a level of ease and precision he hadn't seen in years. There was something almost mystical about the way she moved, as though she was having a conversation with the car. He was beginning to feel a little foolish for doubting her. 10 minutes later, Tessa stepped back, wiping her hands on the same rag she had used earlier. "Try it now," she said, a hint of challenge in her tone. Paul hesitated, still unsure of what had just happened, but climbed into the car. He turned the key. The engine roared to life with a deep, steady sound, far smoother than it had been in years. It was like hearing the Chevelle wake from a long slumber. He turned it off, stunned, and stepped out of the car. "How did you?" Paul stammered, still in disbelief. Tessa shrugged nonchalantly, a half-smile playing on her lips. "It was just a reversed connection in the ignition system. Your engine was asking for help." Paul stood there for a moment, trying to collect himself. He had spent weeks, even months, searching for a solution, and yet it was the girl in the grease-stained jeans who had fixed it in less than 10 minutes. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, his voice a little quieter than usual. Tessa didn't hesitate. "Your salary," she said simply, almost as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Paul let out a short laugh, but it quickly died in his throat as he realized she wasn't joking. He fumbled for his wallet, his pride taking another hit as he handed her the money. "I wasn't serious," he muttered, but Tessa just looked at him calmly, almost as though she was waiting for him to come to terms with the reality of the situation. She didn't gloat, didn't offer any smug remarks. Instead, she simply walked back to the truck she had been working on before Paul arrived, her hands already busy with another task. Paul stood there, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. He had been bested by a mechanic half his age in a dusty, run-down shop that he had never even considered a place for quality work. Yet in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. He had just met someone extraordinary. As Paul stood there, his mind was still reeling from the shock of the engine's sudden revival. He had always been the one in control, the one who made decisions, the one who expected results. Yet here he was, staring at the girl with grease-stained jeans, who had done what the best engineers in Nashville couldn't in a matter of minutes. The Chevelle SS, which had been his pride and joy for years, was now purring like a contented lion, its engine roaring to life as though nothing had ever been wrong with it. His hands were still shaking slightly as he tried to process what had just happened, the usual arrogance of his wealth and power slipping away with each second. Tessa had stepped back, wiping her hands on her rag, and looking at him with that calm, almost indifferent expression she wore. "Try it again," she said, her voice steady and firm. Paul didn't need any more convincing. He'd already done it once, but this time, he did it without hesitation, turning the key again with the smoothness of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The engine roared to life once more, and the sound was rich, deep, and powerful, just like it had been when the car was new. Paul's chest tightened, and for a brief moment, he almost felt a sense of pride. Pride in his car, pride in having this beautiful machine back in working condition, but mostly, pride in having found someone who could fix it. "Remarkable," Paul muttered under his breath, not sure if he was talking to himself or to her. Tessa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she wiped her hands again, picking up a tool and turning back to the truck she had been working on when Paul had first arrived. It was almost as if fixing Paul's Chevelle was no big deal, just another routine repair for her. There was no hint of self-congratulation, no smugness or gloating, Just business. Paul, however, was still staring at the car, his eyes narrowing as he began to question how someone so young, so seemingly out of place in this grimy shop, could possess such skill. "So, how much do I owe you?" he asked, his voice not quite as dismissive as it had been when he first walked in. There was a genuine curiosity now, a need to understand how Tessa could do what he had thought was impossible. Tessa looked at him over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Your salary," she said simply, as if the answer were obvious. Paul froze. "I wasn't serious," he replied quickly, trying to laugh it off. But there was an edge to his voice. He had no intention of paying someone like her, someone who worked in this crumbling, dilapidated shop, a sum like that. It felt absurd, like paying a fortune for a cup of coffee at a street vendor. But Tessa, without missing a beat, simply turned back to her work. "Oh, I'm serious," she said, her voice cool and steady. And for the first time, Paul realized she wasn't trying to make a joke. She was looking at him as though she expected him to follow through. And something about her calm demeanor, her unwavering confidence, made it difficult for Paul to brush it off. He had made a promise, a foolish bet, and now it was time to pay up, even if it felt like swallowing a bitter pill. Paul's pride flared, but he didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his wallet and handed over the money. The crisp bills felt out of place in the dimly lit, cluttered shop, like a stark contrast to the worn tools and grease-streaked surfaces that surrounded him. Tessa took the cash without a word, counting it quickly and nodding. "You know," she said after a moment, her voice still calm, "a man's word is like his reputation. If you promise something, you've got to stick to it." Paul nodded, suddenly feeling small, like a child who had just been caught doing something foolish. He had made a bet, and though he had been joking at first, Tessa had taken it seriously, and in doing so, she had shattered his pride, leaving him to confront his arrogance. He had underestimated her, underestimated the value of someone who could fix an engine with the precision of a surgeon, and now he was paying the price, literally. "Your father taught you well," Paul said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. Tessa didn't respond immediately, instead, focusing on the truck she had been working on. Paul took a step back, realizing just how much he had yet to learn about Tessa, about what made her tick, about the world she inhabited that was so different from his own. She didn't seem like the type to brag or flaunt her skills. She hadn't even been the least bit impressed with herself, and that struck Paul more than anything. In his world, people constantly sought validation, whether through power, status, or wealth. But Tessa, she didn't need any of that. She simply worked. She simply fixed things. After a long moment, Tessa finally looked at him again, her expression still unreadable. "If you're serious about wanting to learn more about engines," she said slowly, her voice low but firm, "I'll teach you. But you've got to be ready to put in the work. No shortcuts." Paul blinked, caught off guard by her offer. "What makes you think I'm interested in learning?" he asked, trying to hide the surprise in his voice. Tessa's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no humor in it. "Because," she said simply, "I can tell you're not used to being told no, and you don't like it. But you're here, aren't you?" Paul was silent for a moment, and as he stood there, looking at the shop, at the woman who had just humbled him, he realized she was right. He was here, wasn't he? The very thing that had brought him to this small, unassuming shop was his inability to fix something that had always been in his control. His car, his prized possession. But now, it seemed that the very thing he had taken for granted, the engine that had once roared with life, had become a symbol of his own helplessness, a reminder that not everything could be bought, not everything could be controlled. "I'm here," Paul admitted quietly. "But what makes you think I can handle it?" Tessa looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and challenge in her eyes. Because if you think you can just walk in here and fix a car by throwing money at it, you're wrong. But if you're willing to get your hands dirty and learn the way I've learned, maybe you'll understand what it means to truly fix something. Paul wasn't sure if he was being humiliated or enlightened, but he knew one thing for sure. Tessa had just thrown down a challenge, and whether he liked it or not, he was going to take it. The days following his visit to the repair shop seemed to blur together for Paul. He couldn't shake the image of Tessa Johnson, her calm confidence, her undeniable skill. It was as if she had unlocked a part of him that he had long forgotten, a part that wasn't interested in power, wealth, or status. No, this was something different. It was an old-school, raw appreciation for something that worked, something that had value, not because of what it was worth in money, but because of how it functioned, how it was created, and how it could be fixed. His Chevelle SS, his family heirloom, now ran perfectly, all thanks to her. For the first time in ages, Paul found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about his world. But the question that lingered in his mind more than anything else was simple. How did she do it? How could she, a young woman from a small, rundown shop, possess the kind of knowledge and intuition about engines that eluded the best minds in his company? His engineers had been unable to pinpoint the problem with his car. They had looked at it from every angle, tested every part, and still couldn't fix it. Yet Tessa, with a few moves and a little listening, had solved it in no time. It was, frankly, maddening, and it gnawed at him. So, Paul decided to do something that wasn't characteristic of him. He picked up the phone and dialed Tessa's number. He had a proposal. "Tessa," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of uncertainty. "I want you to come to my automotive factory. I have an issue with one of our production engines. It's a problem that's been bugging our team for weeks, and I think you could help us. You up for it?" There was a brief pause before Tessa's voice came through the line, clear and composed as always. "You want me to come to your factory?" she repeated, her tone almost skeptical. "Isn't that a bit out of my league?" Paul couldn't help but chuckle. "Maybe, but I'm serious. I need someone who can actually figure this out, and it seems like you're the only one who's been able to do that." Tessa didn't immediately respond. Instead, there was silence on the other end of the line, as if she was mulling over his offer. Then, with her usual coolness, she said, "All right, I'll come. But you better not be wasting my time. I don't work for free." Paul could hear the amusement in her voice, and despite himself, he smiled. "I'll make sure you're compensated fairly," he said. "Just bring your tools." The next day, Paul drove to the factory, his mind swirling with thoughts of the upcoming meeting. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. His engineers were top-notch, and he had built his empire by relying on their expertise. But what if they were wrong? What if Tessa, the woman from the dirty little shop on the corner, could solve the issue in a way no one else had? The thought unsettled him, yet it also intrigued him more than anything he'd felt in years. He was a man used to control, used to having the answers. Now, he was on the verge of inviting someone into his world who had the power to shatter that control, and strangely, he was eager for it. When Tessa arrived at the factory, she was immediately a contrast to the sleek, polished machines and corporate suits that dominated the space. Dressed in her usual grease-stained jeans and a simple t-shirt, she walked in like she owned the place, and for a moment, Paul felt a twinge of embarrassment. He led her through the gleaming hallways, past rows of spotless workbenches and pristine tools. Everything was precise, efficient, and organized, a far cry from the chaos of her shop, where nothing seemed to match, and everything had the charm of something that had been used and loved for years. At the heart of the factory, Paul introduced her to his team of engineers, 5 highly trained professionals, all men, all wearing starched white shirts and looking at Tessa with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. It didn't escape Paul's notice that none of them seemed eager to give her any real respect. One engineer, a man with glasses and a stern face, looked at her as though she were an intruder. "Is she a specialist consultant?" he asked Paul, his voice dripping with doubt as he sized her up. "She's a mechanic," Paul answered, trying to keep his tone neutral, but finding himself suddenly defensive. "She's going to take a look at our issue." The engineers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react to the situation. The man with glasses cleared his throat, clearly not thrilled by the idea, but said nothing more. Tessa walked toward the bench where the V8 engine lay, looking as though it had been torn apart and left to gather dust. She studied it for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "What's the problem?" she asked, looking up at one of the engineers who had been working on it. "The engine starts, but it loses power after a few minutes," the blonde engineer explained. "We've checked everything: fuel injection, electrical systems, and cooling. Everything seems normal in the tests, but the engine still loses power." Tessa nodded slowly, as if taking in the information before taking a pen from her pocket and beginning to jot down a few quick notes on her arm. The engineers watched her like she was some sort of strange creature. She looked back at them with a hint of a smile. "You didn't check the sensor," she said calmly. "Can I take the head off?" Without waiting for an answer, Tessa began working. She wasn't bothered by their scrutiny, didn't seem the least bit intimidated by the formal environment of the factory. Within minutes, she had the head off the engine, inspecting the parts one by one. As she worked, Paul could feel the tension in the room rise. His engineers had spent weeks trying to fix the problem, and yet here was Tessa, a woman with dirt under her nails, stripping down the engine with the efficiency and precision of someone who had done it 100 times before. The engineers stood in stunned silence, barely moving as Tessa pointed to a small, seemingly insignificant sensor. "There's your problem," she said, touching the sensor lightly. "Bad contact in the coolant temperature sensor. It's sending the wrong data to the ECU. The system thinks the engine is overheating, so it cuts the power to protect itself." One of the engineers stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered. "We tested the sensor 3 times, outside the engine." Tessa didn't even flinch. "You tested it outside the engine," she corrected. "The problem only shows up when the engine vibrates. The internal contact is loose." She removed the sensor, cleaned the terminals with a small brush, and reconnected everything. "You can test it now," she said, stepping back with a calm expression. The engineer with the glasses hesitated for a moment, then turned the key. The engine roared to life, smoothly and without hesitation, holding a steady idle as it responded to the gas without faltering. Paul stood back, a sense of awe settling over him. He had just witnessed something that had seemed impossible only hours earlier. His engineers stood speechless, unable to explain how Tessa had figured it out when they had failed. "You're a genius," Paul said, his voice sincere for the first time in their conversation. Tessa shrugged casually, wiping her hands on the rag she had brought with her. "I prefer to be called a mechanic," she said, and with that, she turned and began walking back toward the truck she had been working on earlier. Paul watched her go, feeling a mixture of respect, frustration, and a strange kind of admiration that he couldn't quite place. She had done what no one else could. She had listened to the engine, felt the problem, and fixed it. And as he stood there, watching her work, Paul realized something. He was in the presence of someone far more extraordinary than he had ever imagined. The factory had fallen silent in the wake of Tessa's success. The engineers stood frozen, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. One moment, they were convinced that their calculations and tests would uncover the problem, and the next Tessa, with nothing but intuition and hands-on experience, had solved it in a matter of minutes. Paul felt the weight of the silence settle over the room, but his mind wasn't focused on the awe of her skill. No, he was more intrigued by the way she had approached the entire situation. Calm, collected, and without the need for validation. He had been surrounded by engineers his entire life, men who excelled at the technical aspects of their work, but none of them had the kind of raw, instinctive understanding of machines that Tessa seemed to possess. As the engineers began to regain their composure and quietly went back to their tasks, Paul found himself staring at Tessa, still working on the truck she had left unfinished when she had stepped in to help him. Her movements were fluid, practiced, but not rushed. There was something almost graceful about the way she moved, like a dancer, except her stage was covered in grease and oil, and her tools were her instruments. It wasn't just her knowledge of mechanics that stood out. It was the way she worked with the machines, as if she were in a dialogue with them, as if she could hear their needs and respond to them in a way that no one else could. He couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. He walked over to her, his footsteps slow but determined, and watched as she tightened a bolt on the old truck. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "How do you hear what the engine's saying?" Tessa didn't look up at him immediately. Instead, she continued her work, as if the question wasn't out of the ordinary. Finally, after a moment, she wiped her hands on a rag and turned to face him, her expression thoughtful, but not judgmental. "It's not about hearing the engine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about listening to it. The sounds, the vibrations, they're telling you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen." Paul felt a chill run down his spine. "But that's not how we're taught to work," he said, his voice filled with a hint of disbelief. "We're taught to measure, to analyze, to break things down to their most basic components. It's all about numbers, calculations. That's how you find the problem." Tessa shook her head slowly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see straight through him. "You're right," she said, "but that's only part of the picture. It's important to measure, to analyze, and to understand the parts. But it's just as important to understand the whole. An engine isn't just a collection of metal and wires. It's a living, breathing thing. It has a soul." Paul's brow furrowed as he tried to process her words. "A soul?" he repeated, incredulity in his voice. "Engines don't have souls, Tessa. They're machines. They're designed to function in a precise way, and when something goes wrong, you fix it. That's all there is to it." Tessa stood up from the truck, brushing her hands off, and looked at him, her expression soft but resolute. "Machines, yes," she said. "But engines, real engines, the ones that make a car come to life, they have a story. Every scratch, every vibration, every sound is a part of that story. Think about your Chevelle, for example. You don't just drive it because it looks good. You drive it because of how it feels, how it sounds, how it moves. It's not just a machine. It's a part of you. It's a connection." Paul blinked, stunned by the simplicity of her words. He had never thought about it like that. He had always seen his Chevelle as a symbol of success, something to show off, something to be admired. But what Tessa was saying hit him in a way that he hadn't expected. She wasn't just talking about cars. She was talking about life, about how people often view things as mere tools, as things to be controlled and manipulated, when in reality, those things are a reflection of who we are. His car, the one he had treasured and cared for, was more than just a machine. It was part of his history, his family's history. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I always thought that engines were just engines, that they were just there to do a job. But you make it sound like they're alive, like they have a personality." Tessa nodded slowly, a faint smile on her lips. "Exactly," she said. "Engines have personality. They respond to the way you treat them, just like people do. If you treat them with respect, if you listen to them, they'll tell you what they need. But if you ignore them, if you try to force them to work without understanding them, they'll break down. Paul leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed, still trying to wrap his mind around everything she was saying. "But you make it sound so easy," he said. "You make it sound like you can just listen to the engine, and it will tell you everything. But it's not that simple, is it?" Tessa paused for a moment, her gaze distant as if reflecting on something deep. "No," she said softly, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "It's not easy. It takes time, patience, and experience. I didn't learn all of this overnight. But when you've worked on engines long enough, you start to understand the language. You start to hear what they're telling you. It's like any relationship. It's about trust. The engine has to trust you, and you have to trust the engine." Paul stood there, digesting her words, feeling something shift within him. It wasn't just her philosophy about engines that was captivating. It was her entire approach to life, her unshakable belief that everything had a purpose, a story, and a connection. It was something he had never really considered before, a way of seeing the world that didn't revolve around power, control, or money. It was raw. It was real. And for the first time in a long while, Paul felt like he was on the verge of understanding something much bigger than himself. "I don't know if I can fully get it," he said, his voice almost hesitant now. "But I think I'm starting to understand. Maybe I've been looking at everything the wrong way. Maybe I've been too focused on the parts and not the whole." Tessa smiled, her eyes softening as she took a step closer to him. "It's all right," she said. "It's a process. The important thing is that you're open to learning." Paul nodded, feeling a sense of respect for this woman, who had opened his eyes to a world he hadn't known existed. "I guess," he said slowly, "there's a lot more to engines and to life than I ever realized." Tessa gave him a final, knowing look. "There's a lot more to everything than you think. Just remember, when it comes to fixing engines, or people, patience is key." And with that, Paul felt the weight of the conversation settle into him, knowing that he was standing on the edge of something life-changing. Something that had nothing to do with engines, or money, or status. It had everything to do with listening, learning, and understanding. The days following Tessa's philosophy lesson had been an eye-opening experience for Paul. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning everything about the world he had built. The world that revolved around numbers, calculations, and power. But it wasn't just his professional life that felt off-kilter. His thoughts kept returning to Tessa, the way she moved with ease in the grease, and the way she could listen to an engine, as though it were a living, breathing entity. Her confidence, her grace, and her unwavering belief in the power of understanding. Those things stayed with him long after she left the factory. Paul had always prided himself on his ability to get what he wanted. As a millionaire, a businessman, he had learned to make decisions swiftly, using his influence and money to bend the world to his will. But Tessa was different. She didn't seem interested in money, power, or prestige. She was happy in her little garage, working with her hands and listening to the engines she fixed. Despite his success, Paul found himself drawn to her life, a life that felt more authentic, more real than anything his wealth could offer. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was exactly what his company needed, a mechanic who could not only fix machines, but who could understand them in a way no one else could. He couldn't help but think that her raw, intuitive approach could bring something to Mitchell Automotive that no number of engineers could: heart, soul, and a connection to the work they did. So, after days of considering it, he called her. He had a proposition. "Tessa," he said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of excitement. "I want you to join my team. You've got a gift that we can't replicate at Mitchell Automotive. I think you'd be perfect as a senior consultant. We need someone with your kind of insight, someone who can teach our engineers to listen to the engines, not just analyze them. We need your expertise." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Paul's heart raced as he waited for her response. In his mind, it was the perfect opportunity for both of them. She could work with the best equipment, the latest technology, and, most importantly, she wouldn't have to worry about money ever again. It seemed like a no-brainer. But when Tessa finally spoke, her voice was calm and steady, without a hint of surprise or excitement. "You want me to come work for you?" she repeated, almost amused. "You want me to leave my shop and join your company?" Paul shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping on the edge of the desk. "Yes, exactly. You've got the skills, Tessa. You've got a vision. I think we could use you on our team. Plus, you'd have access to resources and tools you couldn't even dream of in that little shop of yours." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I can offer you a salary that's far more than what you make now. I'm talking real money, Tessa. No more struggling with outdated equipment. No more worrying about overhead. You'd be working with a world-class team, and you'd have the power to shape the direction of the company." Tessa didn't respond right away. Paul could almost hear her thinking, weighing the offer. He had expected her to jump at the chance. Who wouldn't? But the silence stretched on, longer than he was comfortable with. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer yet firm. "Paul, I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I'm not interested. I don't want to work for you. I don't want to work for anyone. I've built my life the way I want it. I'm not interested in changing that, no matter how shiny your offer is." Paul felt a jolt of confusion. "But why? Tessa, this could change everything for you. You'd have everything you ever needed: security, comfort, the ability to do the work you love without the struggle. It's everything you've ever wanted." He leaned forward, his voice rising with the urgency he felt. "Why wouldn't you want that?" Tessa's laughter came through the phone, light but filled with a quiet strength. "I'm not struggling, Paul. Maybe I don't have all the fancy stuff, but I've got what matters. I've got my hands, my tools, and the work that keeps me grounded. That's enough for me. I don't need your money, and I don't need your company. What I do need is the freedom to fix engines, to listen to them, and connect with them in the way I've always done. That's where I find my value, not in a paycheck, not in a corporate office." Paul was silent, the words sinking in like a heavy stone. He hadn't expected this kind of rejection, not after everything he had offered. His mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. Tessa wasn't driven by money, nor was she interested in the prestige that came with working for a company like Mitchell Automotive. She was driven by something else entirely, something that he couldn't quite understand, but something that made her different from anyone he had ever met. "But, Tessa, you'd be able to do so much more. You could have the resources to work on so many more engines, to teach others what you know," he insisted, his voice softening. "You'd be making a real difference in the industry." "I am making a difference," she replied. "In my way, on my terms. I don't need a corporate title or a fancy office to prove that. I've worked with engines for years, and that's all the satisfaction I need. I don't need a salary that's higher than my father's to feel like I'm valuable." Paul let her words sink in. It was as if everything he had worked for, everything he had come to believe about success and fulfillment, was being questioned by someone who seemed to live a completely different truth. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth and gathering influence. Yet here was Tessa, perfectly content with a small shop and a life that revolved around the work she loved. He couldn't understand it, but he knew she meant it. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, the challenge he had once felt fading into a new understanding. "You don't want to take this opportunity?" "I'm sure," Tessa replied simply. "I have everything I need right here, Paul. I'm doing what I love, and that's more than enough for me. I don't need anything else." For a moment, Paul didn't know what to say. He had expected Tessa to see things from his perspective, to understand the opportunity he was offering. But she hadn't. Instead, she had stood her ground, holding tight to the values she believed in. It was a lesson he hadn't expected to learn. And yet, there it was. "Well, I can't say I understand it," Paul said, his voice thoughtful. "But I respect it. I really do." "Thank you," Tessa said, her tone warmer now. "But don't think this is the end of the road, Paul. You've learned something today, even if it's not what you expected. And maybe one day, you'll see that what I'm doing here is just as important as anything you're doing at Mitchell Automotive." Paul let out a long breath, realizing that Tessa wasn't just rejecting an offer. She was teaching him something he hadn't expected to learn. About work, about values, and about the kind of life that was truly worth living. "I'll respect your decision," he said finally. "But if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." Tessa smiled on the phone, her voice soft. "I won't need to, Paul. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." As the line went dead, Paul leaned back in his chair, feeling both defeated and enlightened. Tessa had turned down everything he had thought was important, and in doing so, she had shown him a different kind of wealth, one that didn't come from money or status. It came from passion, from work that meant something, from doing something that mattered, regardless of the rewards. It had been 3 days since Tessa turned down his offer, and Paul couldn't stop thinking about her decision. It wasn't just that she had refused to join Mitchell Automotive. It was the way she had done it, the calm certainty in her voice as she told him that she didn't need what he had to offer. Her refusal had left him feeling both perplexed and humbled. For years, Paul had been driven by success, status, and wealth, believing that these were the things that made life meaningful. But Tessa had shown him that there was a different kind of success, one that didn't require money, a fancy office, or corporate power. She had built a life on passion, on skill, and on doing work that had real value to her, something Paul had never truly understood until now. For the first time in his life, Paul felt a need to step out of his own world. He was used to managing large teams, making decisions from behind a desk, and being in charge of the operations. But Tessa's world was different. She didn't rely on anyone to tell her what to do or how to fix a problem. She trusted her hands, her intuition, and her understanding of the work itself. And so, after much internal struggle, Paul made a decision. He would learn from her, not as a boss to an employee, but as a student to a teacher. He had to understand her approach, and maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to apply it to his own life. The next morning, Paul arrived at Barnes & Sons Auto Repair just as the sun was rising, the first rays of light cutting through the mist in the small town of Brentwood. He had dressed casually, in a simple pair of jeans and an old t-shirt, nothing like the business suits he usually wore. He parked his car outside the shop, staring at the peeling sign above the entrance. It was clear that this place wasn't much, dusty, old, and unpolished. But it was real, in a way that his corporate world could never be. Tessa was already there, as always, her back to him as she worked on an old engine. She was covered in grease, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, and her focus was entirely on the machine in front of her. She didn't even notice Paul approach, which, in a way, made him feel like an intruder in her space. He cleared his throat, and Tessa looked up, surprised to see him standing there. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone curious but cautious. "I came to learn," Paul said, his voice steady but unsure. "I want to understand how you do it, how you fix things, how you see things that the rest of us miss." Tessa paused for a moment, looking at him as though she were trying to gauge his sincerity. "You're serious?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. "You're not here just to watch or show off your shiny car again, are you?" Paul shook his head. "No, I'm serious. I want to learn. I want to understand what it is that makes you so good at this." Tessa studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "All right. If you're going to do this, you need to leave your ego at the door. This isn't about impressing anyone. It's about working with your hands and understanding the engine for what it is. Can you do that?" Paul hesitated for a moment, but the sincerity in her voice made him realize he had no choice. "I can do that," he said firmly, his resolve building. Tessa motioned for him to come closer, and Paul stepped forward, looking at the engine in front of her. It was an old Ford, its hood raised and parts scattered around the workbench. "This is a carburetor issue," she explained, "but it's not just about replacing parts. It's about understanding why it failed in the first place. You have to listen to the engine, feel its rhythm, understand its story." Paul watched intently as she began to disassemble the carburetor, her hands moving with ease and precision. It was clear that she wasn't just going through the motions. Each movement was deliberate, each decision based on something deeper. She wasn't just fixing the machine, she was communicating with it. As Paul observed, Tessa began to explain her process. "Engines are like people," she said, her voice calm and steady as she worked. "They don't work in isolation. Every part affects another, and if you don't understand the whole system, you're just guessing. When I look at an engine, I don't just see metal and wires. I see the history behind it. I feel its needs." Paul nodded slowly, trying to absorb what she was saying. "But don't you just follow the manual? Doesn't the factory spec tell you exactly how to fix it?" Tessa looked up at him, her eyes sharp. "The manual is just a guide. It tells you the basics, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. It doesn't tell you how the engine feels, how it responds to the driver, or how it reacts to the wear and tear over time. That's something you have to learn by experience." Paul's mind raced as he processed her words. He had always relied on instructions, on protocols, on the best practices developed by engineers and scientists. But Tessa was telling him that there was more to it than that. There was something unquantifiable, something that came with time, patience, and an understanding that couldn't be captured in a manual. "I've never thought about it like that," he admitted quietly. "I have always focused on efficiency, on the numbers. If something doesn't work, we replace it. But you're saying that it's more than that. It's about feeling the problem." Tessa nodded. "Exactly. You can replace a part, but that doesn't mean you've fixed the problem. You have to get to the root of it, understand why the part failed in the first place. That's how you truly fix something." Paul watched her work for hours, trying his best to keep up, but he was clumsy and inexperienced. His hands were stiff, and every time he picked up a tool, he felt out of place. Tessa, on the other hand, moved fluidly, as if she were born to do this. She didn't rush. She didn't force anything. Everything she did seemed effortless. And yet it was the result of years of practice, of learning the language of engines. Around midday, Tessa stepped back and wiped her hands on her rag. "All right, you're ready to try," she said, gesturing toward the engine. "See if you can get this carburetor back together. Don't think about it too much, just feel your way through it." Paul swallowed hard. This was it, his chance to prove he was capable of more than just business decisions. He crouched down beside the workbench and started to reassemble the carburetor. His hands were shaky at first, but as he worked, he began to focus on the individual parts, trying to understand their function, trying to connect with them the way Tessa did. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't fast, but Paul slowly began to feel the rhythm of the work. With each turn of the wrench, he started to understand what Tessa meant. It wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about creating a relationship with it, understanding it for what it was, and allowing it to tell its own story. After what felt like an eternity, Paul finally stepped back. "I think I've done it," he said, his voice unsure. Tessa leaned in, inspecting his work. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing for a moment. Then, to Paul's surprise, she smiled. "Not bad," she said. "You've got the basics down. Now you just need to keep practicing. The more you work with your hands, the more you'll start to understand." Paul stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had taken the first step toward understanding something that had always been beyond his grasp. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had truly accomplished something with his own hands, not just with his money or his position. "I don't think I've ever worked this hard in my life," he admitted, wiping the sweat from his brow. Tessa gave him a wry smile. "Welcome to the real world, Paul. You'll get used to it." And in that moment, Paul realized that this was just the beginning. He wasn't just learning about engines. He was learning about himself. He was learning what it meant to truly create, to truly fix, and to truly understand. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The weeks following his day of learning at Barnes & Sons Auto Repair changed something fundamental inside Paul. He had never imagined that a few days of working with his hands would leave such an impression. What started as a simple desire to understand Tessa's philosophy had transformed into a new understanding of his limitations. He wasn't just learning how to fix engines. He was learning how to work with purpose, how to connect with something beyond mere efficiency and profit. It was something deeper, something that began to resonate with him long after the last wrench had been put down. One afternoon, Paul found himself sitting in his office, staring out the large window that overlooked the sprawling corporate complex of Mitchell Automotive Industries. The building was sleek and modern, a monument to everything he had built over the years. But in the pit of his stomach, it suddenly felt hollow. He thought back to Tessa's shop, the way she moved with such calm confidence, not driven by the need for success or accolades, but by the satisfaction of a job well done. She worked in a place filled with old tools and faded manuals, yet she had found a way to make a real difference in the world by simply doing what she loved. It was then that an idea began to form in Paul's mind, one that would challenge everything he had believed in until now. He picked up the phone and dialed Tessa's number. When she answered, her voice was as steady as always, but there was a warmth in it now, a recognition that things had changed between them. "Tessa," Paul said, his voice firm, yet filled with a new sense of purpose. "I've been thinking about something that might be able to change everything, about how we approach this work, about what we could offer to others." "What are you getting at?" Tessa's voice was cautious, but Paul could tell she was intrigued. "I think we should open a school," he said. "A community mechanic school. Somewhere where people can learn the skills that matter. Not just theory and numbers, but the real, hands-on work. The kind of work you do every day. I want to give others the same opportunity to learn the craft the way you've learned it. No frills, no flashy equipment, just solid practical experience." Tessa was silent for a moment, and Paul could feel her weighing his words. "You want to open a school?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "And what makes you think people will want to learn that way?" "I've seen it firsthand, Tessa," Paul replied. "Your approach, it's real. People are hungry for it. They want to learn something tangible, something that gives them a skill they can be proud of. And I think we can offer that. We could use the land next to my factory for the school. It's not much, but it's a start. I've got the resources to make it happen. And you'll be the heart of it. You'll teach people what it means to be a mechanic, to feel an engine, to understand the stories it tells." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Paul could feel his excitement rising. He knew this was a big leap, but he also knew it was the right one. Finally, Tessa spoke, her voice soft, but filled with resolve. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" she asked. Paul nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'm serious. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Tessa was quiet for a few more seconds, then let out a breath. "All right, Paul. If we're doing this, it's gotta be real. I'm not interested in a corporate venture. I don't want anything flashy. It's gotta be about the work, about the people who want to learn, and about teaching them what it means to fix something with your hands. If that's what you're offering, then I'll be in." Paul's heart raced with excitement. "That's exactly what I'm offering, Tessa. A place where people can learn without all the corporate nonsense. We'll keep it small, keep it personal, and focus on the skills that matter." A few weeks later, the plans for the school were starting to take shape. Paul had used his influence to secure the land next to Mitchell Automotive, and together, he and Tessa began working on the details. They decided to call it the Barnes Motors Community Mechanic School, a tribute to Tessa's late father, Edward Barnes, a man whose name had never been properly recognized for his contributions to the automotive industry. The school would offer courses on everything from engine repair to welding, bodywork to electrical systems, with a focus on hands-on experience rather than theoretical knowledge. It was a simple concept, but it was a powerful one. Tessa's involvement in the project was crucial. She helped design the curriculum, deciding that every student would start with the basics, learning how to take apart an engine, understanding how each part worked, and developing the ability to listen to the machines they worked on. She wasn't interested in teaching them to memorize equations or formulas. She wanted them to feel the engines, to understand them in a way that couldn't be learned from a book. For her, the school was more than just a place to teach. It was a way to give others the same connection to the work that had shaped her life. Paul, for his part, was determined to make the school as accessible as possible. He arranged for scholarships and financial aid for students who couldn't afford the fees. He didn't want money to be a barrier to anyone who wanted to learn, and he was committed to keeping the school's costs as low as possible. He also worked tirelessly behind the scenes, securing donations of old tools and equipment from his network of business contacts. The last thing he wanted was for the school to be just another corporate entity. He wanted it to be a true community effort, one that would empower people and give them a chance to build a future based on skills that would never go out of style. As the school began to take shape, Paul found himself spending more and more time at Barnes & Sons Auto Repair, working side by side with Tessa. He helped with the physical aspects of getting the school ready, painting, building, assembling workstations. But he also found himself increasingly drawn to the work itself. For the first time in his life, he was getting his hands dirty, not just as an observer, but as someone who was truly involved. He worked on old engines, learned how to repair transmissions, and even fixed a few cars on his own. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but there was something deeply satisfying about doing something that didn't require a spreadsheet or a conference call. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Paul stood outside the school, staring at the building that was slowly taking shape. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the property, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was more than just a project for him. It was a new beginning, not just for the people who would come to learn, but for him as well. He had spent so many years chasing success, chasing power, but now, standing there in the quiet of the evening, he realized that he had found something much more valuable: purpose. Tessa came up behind him, wiping her hands on a rag. "We're almost there," she said, her voice softer than usual. Paul turned to face her, his expression full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice sincere. "This is going to change everything. Not just for the students, but for me too." Tessa smiled, her eyes warm. "We're in this together, Paul. And if you want to make a difference, you've got to keep listening. Keep feeling the work. That's how we'll know we're on the right path." Paul nodded, his heart full. "I'm listening," he said. "And I'm ready." As they stood there together, looking at the future they were building, Paul knew that this was only the beginning. They were creating something that was about more than just fixing engines. It was about fixing lives, about teaching others the value of real work, real skill, and real connection. The Barnes Motors Community Mechanic School was more than just a school. It was a place where people would learn to make something with their hands, and in doing so, learn something about themselves. And Paul realized that, in the process, he was learning something about himself too. He was learning that the most valuable things in life weren't found in the boardroom or on a balance sheet. They were found in the work that you did with your hands, the people you worked alongside, and the stories you built together. The sun had begun to set over the small town of Brentwood, casting a golden hue over the nearly completed Barnes Motors Community Mechanic School. The paint on the walls was still fresh, the workstations were set, and the smell of new tools and wood filled the air. It had been a long journey, one that had started with nothing more than an idea and the shared determination of Paul and Tessa. And now, standing in front of the school they had built together, Paul realized that it wasn't just the building that had changed. He had changed too. He watched Tessa from across the yard as she moved around, talking to some of the students who had already started coming by to take a look at the school before the opening. Her hands were still covered in grease, and her hair was still tied back in a messy ponytail. But there was a glow to her that Paul hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the satisfaction of the work done, though. It was something more. She was standing at the center of this community, teaching, guiding, sharing her knowledge, and making a real impact. Something Paul had never imagined possible until now. She had built a life based on passion, purpose, and skill. And for the first time in his life, Paul realized that this was exactly the kind of life he wanted. But there was one more thing, one more step that Paul had been holding back. In the quiet of the past few weeks, as they had worked together to set the school up, something had shifted in him. He wasn't just in awe of Tessa's work ethic or her knowledge. He was in awe of her as a person. He had seen the way she connected with people, the way she listened to their stories, the way she cared about more than just the engines she fixed. She cared about the people, the community, and the future. And for Paul, who had spent so many years chasing success, always thinking about the next deal or the next acquisition, Tessa's approach to life was a revelation. She had taught him that success wasn't just about what you achieved. It was about who you were, how you treated people, and what you gave back. As he stood there, watching her talk to a group of students, Paul felt his heart race. He knew without a doubt that this was where he belonged now. It wasn't the corporate world he had come from, nor the shiny offices or the glossy board meetings. It was here, with Tessa, working on something that mattered, something that would leave a lasting impact. He knew that he wanted to spend the rest of his life doing this, building something together with her, and growing not just a business, but a life. But he needed to take one more step, something that had been on his mind for weeks. As he walked toward Tessa, the realization hit him like a wave. He wanted more than just to build a school with her. He wanted to build a future. He wanted to make a promise, a commitment to her, to what they had started together. And as the weight of that thought settled in, he knew there was no turning back. He had to ask. "Tessa," Paul said, his voice steady but laced with the excitement he was trying to keep in check. "There's something I need to say. Something that's been on my mind for a long time." Tessa turned to him, her eyes sharp, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it, Paul?" He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I don't just want to build a school with you," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "I want to build a life. I want to build a future together. Everything I've learned over these past few months, it's changed me. You've changed me. I don't want to do this without you. I want you by my side for the rest of our lives." Tessa's expression softened as she listened, but there was a trace of hesitation in her eyes, a small part of her that seemed uncertain. Paul had seen that look before, but now it felt different, almost like a test. He knew this wasn't just about offering her a life in the corporate world or offering her more money or success. It was about offering her something real, something that came from the heart. "I'm not asking you to change, Tessa," Paul continued, taking a step closer. "I'm asking you to be a part of something real, a future where we build something together, where we teach others, where we keep doing what we love, where we make a difference." For a long moment, Tessa didn't say anything, and Paul felt the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. He could hear the sounds of the students around them, the low hum of activity as the school began to come to life. But all that mattered in that moment was Tessa. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Paul," she said quietly, "you've learned a lot these past few months. But this is a big step. It's not just about fixing engines. It's about fixing lives. And I need to know that you're ready for that. That you're ready for this. For what it means to be part of something like this." Paul nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm ready, Tessa. I've never been more ready in my life. And I want to spend the rest of my life learning from you, working with you, building something that will last. Something real." Tessa's gaze softened, and Paul saw the walls she had built around herself begin to fall. She had always kept her heart guarded, always focused on the work, but now, in the quiet of the moment, Paul knew she was considering his words. "And you're sure about this?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "You want this life, with me, in this world?" "I want this life with you," Paul said, his voice firm with certainty. "And I don't just want to build a school. I want to build a future with you, no matter what it takes." Tessa's eyes shone, a glimmer of something more than just acceptance in them. She stepped closer to him, her hands warm against his chest. "All right, Paul," she said, her voice now soft and full of emotion. "Let's do it. Together." Paul's heart soared as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished box. Tessa's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing a simple yet beautiful ring, one that had been crafted from a bolt, a small piece of the Chevelle SS that had first brought them together. He had kept it for months, waiting for the right moment, and now, standing in front of Tessa, he knew this was it. "Tessa Barnes," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Will you marry me? Will you be a part of this life, this journey, not just as a partner in the work, but as my partner in everything?" Tessa looked at the ring, then back at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Paul's breath caught in his chest, the fear of rejection creeping up. But then slowly, Tessa smiled. "Yes," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Yes, I will." The world seemed to stop for a moment, the sound of the students and the work around them fading into the background. Paul reached out, taking her hand and slipping the ring onto her finger. They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other, knowing that everything had changed. This was the beginning of something new, something real. As the sun set behind them, casting a warm, golden light over the school they had built, Paul and Tessa knew that they were not just building a school. They were building a life together, a life filled with purpose, passion, and the promise of a future that would last forever. Thank you for joining us on this journey with Paul and Tessa. Their story reminds us that true success isn't just about wealth or status, but about passion, hard work, and the connections we build along the way. We'd love to hear your thoughts on their journey. What inspired you the most? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you in the future. See you next time.